Imagine being dragged through freezing stone corridors in the dead of winter, your screams echoing off castle walls, while guards laugh at your terror. What I'm about to reveal isn't some Hollywood fantasy. These are the actual documented horrors that happened behind the thick walls of medieval winter castles. The torture chambers weren't just about punishment. What really went on in those frozen dungeons was far more twisted, far more personal, and absolutely sickening. By the end of this video, you'll understand why prisoners preferred execution over what awaited them in the darkness. Trust me, this gets darker than you can possibly imagine. The medieval castle dungeon system was designed with one brutal purpose: complete psychological and physical domination through systematic abuse. Winter months transformed these already nightmarish places into frozen hells, where the cold became another instrument of torture. Lords and nobles maintained absolute power through fear, and the dungeon was where that fear was manufactured. The stone walls, sometimes 6 feet thick, ensured no scream would ever reach the outside world. What made winter particularly horrifying was how dungeon masters weaponized the cold itself. Prisoners were stripped of proper clothing and left in cells where temperatures dropped below freezing. But this wasn't simple exposure. It was calculated torture. Guards would throw buckets of ice water on prisoners throughout the night, ensuring they never reached the brief warmth of sleep. The body's desperate attempts to survive created its own torture, as violent shivering made existing injuries exponentially more painful. Frostbite would set in slowly, blackening fingers and toes before the flesh simply died and fell away. The sheer vulnerability of prisoners in these dungeons went far beyond what most history books dare to document. Female prisoners, in particular, faced a terrifying reality where they were completely at the mercy of their captors. Castle records show women were often kept in states of deliberate humiliation, their dignity stripped away to facilitate breaking their spirit. Winter made this violation even more cruel. Victims were given the choice between freezing to death in their cells or complying with their abusers' demands for the temporary privilege of warmth near the guard. Quarters. Young prisoners weren't spared either. Pages and squires caught stealing or disobeying were subject to what guards called breaking-in rituals. These boys, some as young as 12, were passed between guards for brutal labor and degrading personal servitude during long winter nights. The aristocracy's darkest secret was that this dehumanization was often sanctioned at the highest levels. Lords would select prisoners specifically for these purposes, treating human beings like personal property to be used, exploited, and discarded. The torture devices used in winter castles were designed to maximize suffering while keeping victims alive for extended periods. The strappado involved tying a prisoner's hands behind their back, attaching them to a rope, and hoisting them off the ground. In winter, this was done in courtyards where icy winds would freeze the dislocated shoulders, while guards threw snowballs or buckets of ice water at the hanging victim. The pain of torn ligaments combined with frostbite created a unique agony that could last for hours. The rack was another favorite winter torture. As the device slowly pulled limbs from their sockets, the cold air would freeze the sweat on the victim's body, creating a layer of ice that guards would scrape off with dulled blades. This wasn't about information extraction. It was pure sadism. Records show that torture sessions were often turned into public spectacles for other guards. The psychological torture of being publicly broken and humiliated was considered an art form among experienced dungeon masters. Perhaps the most disturbing aspect was how the dungeon was used as a source of grim entertainment during winter feasts. Noble guests would be invited to observe special mock trials in the dungeon after dinner. Prisoners, broken and starved, would be forced to confess to absurd or impossible crimes, while drunken aristocrats placed bets on who would break first or last the longest. This wasn't rare or exceptional, it was a display of absolute power. Women accused of adultery or witchcraft faced particularly creative cruelty. Rather than simple execution, they were often subjected to devices designed for maximum public shaming. They would be paraded before the castle, staff, and court, forced to wear heavy, painful instruments of humiliation while being pelted with frozen mud and refuse. The goal was the complete annihilation of their social standing before their eventual death. The dungeons also served as breeding grounds for disease and infection. With no concept of hygiene and prisoners kept in inhumane, close quarters, sickness ran rampant. Guards and staff who interacted with the prisoners would then return to their quarters, spreading disease to the castle staff and even noble families. The winter isolation meant these epidemics would burn through the entire castle population, with no outside medical help available for months. Castle records from the 1300s show entire dungeons being sealed and burned with prisoners still inside when infections got out of control. Children born into these horrific conditions faced the worst fate of all. These infants were considered property of the castle and were often left to die from exposure. Some were kept alive for years, raised in the dungeons and trained as future servants or apprentices to the dungeon masters. By age 5 or 6, these children knew nothing but violence and abuse, and they would eventually perpetuate the same horrors on the next generation of prisoners. The psychological manipulation was perhaps more horrifying than the physical torture. Guards would offer prisoners impossible choices: inflict pain on a fellow prisoner or watch your family member be tortured. Many prisoners were forced to participate in the torture of loved ones, with guards promising mercy that never came. Fathers were made to turn the screw on their sons, while wives were forced to brand their husbands. The goal was complete destruction of human dignity and family bonds, creating broken shells who would never rebel or resist again. Winter isolation amplified every psychological torture technique. With months of darkness and cold stretching ahead, prisoners had no hope of rescue or escape. Guards would describe in graphic detail what was planned for tomorrow, next week, next month, creating an anticipatory dread that was its own torture. Sleep was prevented through random attacks and noise, breaking down mental resistance until prisoners would beg for death, only to be kept alive for months more of abuse. The economic aspect reveals the calculated nature of this horror. Castle ledgers show prisoners were valued assets to be exploited. Wealthy families would pay ransoms, but even after payment, prisoners often remained captive for additional fees or were forced into hard labor. This system of exploitation generated significant income for castle management, with winter months being particularly profitable when noble visitors were trapped inside and bored. Some castles exploited the skills of captured artisans or laborers, forcing them to work on castle repairs or create goods for the lord. The winter season, when travel was impossible, meant these captives had no chance of escape or rescue. They would be worked to exhaustion. Those who resisted or became too weak were typically executed in creative public displays, meant to terrorize other prisoners into compliance. The frozen moats made perfect dumping grounds for bodies that wouldn't be discovered until spring thaw. The legacy of these winter castle horrors extends into modern torture techniques used by authoritarian regimes today. The systematic use of cold as a weapon, the combination of physical and psychological torture, and the destruction of family bonds, all of these methods have medieval precedents. What happened in those dungeons wasn't random cruelty, but a sophisticated system of control through terror that has been refined over centuries. Historical records show that castle lords kept detailed journals describing torture techniques and prisoner-breaking strategies. These journals were passed down through noble families. Some of these manuscripts survived and are now locked away in private collections and museum archives, too disturbing for public display. Historians who have read them describe content so graphic and detailed that it proves this wasn't aberrant behavior by a few sadistic individuals. It was institutionalized, systematic, and widely practiced across medieval Europe. The medieval winter castle dungeons represent humanity at its absolute worst, where power, sadism, and opportunity combined to create hell on earth. These weren't isolated incidents or exaggerated legends. They were documented, systematic practices that reveal the darkest capabilities of human nature when given absolute power over other human beings. The cold stone walls kept these secrets hidden for centuries, but historical records don't lie. If this video opened your eyes to the brutal reality of medieval history that textbooks skip over, make sure you're subscribed to Flow of History. We dig into the disturbing truths that other channels won't touch. Hit that like button if you made it through this entire video, and drop a comment telling me what dark historical topic you want explored next. Flow of History brings you the unfiltered truth about humanity's past, no matter how uncomfortable. See you in the next one.